He left her to die with their triplets during her cancer. Years later, he never expected to see her again. She was supposed to be dead. That's what David had told himself for 7 years. That Isabella couldn't have survived the cancer, not alone, not with 3 babies. But there she stood in line at the grocery store, her cart full of lunchboxes and juice pouches, and when she turned around, the apple she was holding dropped to the floor with a sound that shattered his world. Hello, family. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten and stories that deserve to be heard. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. Because together, we are not just telling stories. We are keeping hope alive. David Thornton adjusted his tie in the reflection of his BMW's window, the motion as automatic as breathing. 7 years of success had taught him to perfect the image. The confident smile, the firm handshake, the way he could make anyone believe he had his life together. His phone buzzed with another client message, another deal closing, another zero added to his account. But success, he'd learned, was just expensive noise that couldn't quite drown out the silence. He grabbed a basket from the grocery store entrance, scanning his mental list. Protein bars, coffee, frozen dinners, the diet of a man who ate to survive rather than live. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular grocery store pallor that made even the freshest produce look tired. David moved through the aisles, avoiding eye contact with other shoppers. He'd perfected the art of being alone in crowds, of existing without truly being present. It was safer that way. Safer than remembering what it felt like to belong somewhere, to someone. Meanwhile, 3 aisles over, Isabella Winters pushed her cart with the fluid grace of someone who'd turned grocery shopping into an art form. Her list was color-coded: green for Lily's soccer snacks, blue for James's school lunch preferences, red for Grace's dance class treats. 3 children, 3 different personalities, 3 reasons to get up every morning and choose strength over surrender. Mom, can we get the cookies with the rainbow sprinkles? Grace's voice echoed from memory. She was at dance practice now, but Isabella could hear her daughters laugh in every aisle. The triplets were 7 years old, the same age as her survival. 7 years since the doctors had given her 6 months. 7 years since she'd learned that sometimes the people who promise to love you forever are the first ones to run when forever gets complicated. She paused in the produce section, her fingers automatically selecting the ripest apples. The motion was meditative now, this careful choosing, this deliberate living. Every apple was a small victory, every meal planned was proof that she'd not just survived, she'd learned to thrive. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor. Kids are great. Grace nailed her routine. Pick up at 6. She smiled, typing back a quick thank you. It had taken years to build this network, this chosen family of friends and neighbors who'd stepped in when blood family had failed her. But she'd done it, one relationship at a time, one trust rebuilt after another. The scar along her collarbone was hidden beneath her sweater, but she felt it sometimes when she moved certain ways. Not with pain anymore, but with pride. It was her battle scar, her proof that she was stronger than anything life could throw at her. The chemotherapy had taken her hair, but it had grown back thicker. The surgery had left marks, but they'd faded into silver lines that caught the light like jewelry. David rounded the corner into the produce section, his mind already 3 steps ahead to his evening routine. Gym, dinner, Netflix, sleep. Rinse and repeat. It was a life carefully constructed to avoid surprises, to maintain the equilibrium he'd built on the foundation of forgetting. He reached for a bag of pre-washed salad, the kind that promised convenience over flavor, when he heard it. A laugh. Not just any laugh, but one that reached into his chest and squeezed his heart like a fist. He froze, his hand suspended over the refrigerated case, afraid to turn around, afraid to confirm what his body already knew. Isabella was examining apples, holding each one up to the light with the same careful attention she'd once given to choosing paint colors for their first apartment. Her hair was shorter now, a sleek bob that framed her face in a way that made her look both older and somehow more herself. She wore a soft gray sweater and jeans, simple clothes that couldn't hide the quiet confidence she carried like armor. She was supposed to be dead. The thought hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision blur at the edges. 7 years of telling himself that story. 7 years of believing that his abandonment hadn't been the ultimate betrayal because surely she hadn't survived long enough to truly hate him for it. But there she was, alive and beautiful and reaching for an apple with hands that should have been still and cold but instead moved with purpose and grace. There she was, and David realized that all his success, all his careful reconstruction of his life, had been built on a lie. Isabella turned, apple in hand, and their eyes met across 15 feet of grocery store space that might as well have been an ocean. The apple fell. It hit the linoleum floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the entire store, rolling slowly toward the banana display as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Isabella's hand remained suspended in the air where the fruit had been, her fingers still curved around empty space. Isabella! David's voice cracked on her name like he was 17 again, like he hadn't spent 7 years training himself to speak with authority and confidence. The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the fluorescent-lit silence of the produce section, it might as well have been a scream. She didn't move. Couldn't move. Her body had turned to stone the moment she'd seen his face. Older now, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but unmistakably him. Unmistakably the man who had looked at her swollen belly and her bald head and her four-pole and said, "I can't do this." "You're." David took a step forward, his basket forgotten, lettuce and protein bars scattered across the floor where he dropped them. "You're alive." The words hung between them like an accusation. Like he was disappointed. Like her survival was somehow an inconvenience to the narrative he'd constructed about his own life. Isabella's throat worked soundlessly for a moment before she found her voice. When she spoke, it was with the careful control of someone who had learned to modulate every emotion, to never let anyone see her break. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm alive." The way she said it, flat, matter-of-fact, like she was commenting on the weather, made David's chest tighten with something that felt like drowning. There was no surprise in her voice, no joy at seeing him. Just acknowledgement, like he was a stranger asking for directions. "The cancer," he stammered, his hands gesturing helplessly. "The doctors said. They said you had 6 months. That was 7 years ago." "I know how long it's been, David." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the handle of her shopping cart. "I've lived every single day of those 7 years." The emphasis on lived hit him like a slap. She'd lived. While he'd been telling himself she was dead, building his guilt into a monument to his own tragedy, she'd been living. Breathing. Raising their children. Surviving. "The babies," he whispered, and for the first time, real emotion cracked through Isabella's composure. Her jaw tightened, and something dangerous flashed in her eyes. "Their names are Lily, James, and Grace," she said, each word precise as a scalpel. "And they're not babies anymore. They're 7 years old. They play soccer and take dance classes and ask questions about their father that I've spent 7 years learning how to answer." David felt the blood drain from his face. They're okay? They're healthy. No thanks to you." The words came out sharp enough to cut, and Isabella immediately looked surprised at her own venom. She'd worked so hard to let go of the anger, to build a life free from bitterness. But seeing him here, looking shocked that she'd survived, looking like her existence was somehow an inconvenience, it brought everything rushing back. "Isabella, don't." She held up a hand, and he fell silent. "Don't you dare stand there and act like you care about their well-being now. Don't you dare act like you have any right to ask about them." Other shoppers were starting to notice the tension, giving them a wide berth as they navigated around the dropped groceries and the two people standing frozen in the middle of the produce section like survivors of some invisible explosion. "I thought you were going to die," David said, his voice breaking. "The doctors said." "The doctors said a lot of things." Isabella's laugh was bitter, hollow. They said I might not make it through the surgery. They said the chemo might not work. They said raising 3 newborns while fighting cancer was impossible. But you know what they didn't say, David? They didn't say it was okay for you to abandon us. The word abandon hit him like a physical blow. He'd spent 7 years using softer words, left, couldn't handle it, needed space. But she was right. He'd abandoned them. Abandoned her when she was at her most vulnerable. Abandoned his children before they'd even had a chance to know him. I was scared, he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. I was 25 and terrified, and I didn't know how to. I was 23, Isabella cut him off, her voice rising for the first time. I was 23 and bald and throwing up from chemo and trying to figure out how to breastfeed 3 babies with a body that was trying to kill me. But I didn't run. The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at her, really seeing her for the first time. Not the ghost he'd been carrying around for 7 years, but the woman she'd become. Strong, fierce, unbreakable in a way that made his own perceived strength look like tissue paper. I need to go, Isabella said finally, her voice steady again, controlled. My children are waiting for me. She started to push her cart past him, but David's hand shot out, not quite touching her but blocking her path. Please, he said, and the desperation in his voice made her pause. Please, can we talk? Just for a minute. Isabella looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. You had 7 years to talk, David. 7 years to pick up the phone, to send a letter, to show up and see if we were okay. You chose silence then. She moved her cart around his outstretched arm. Don't ask me to choose differently now. Do you think Isabella should give David a chance to explain, or is she right to walk away? Share your thoughts below. David stood frozen in the produce section long after Isabella had disappeared around the corner, her words echoing in his head like a song he couldn't shake. Other shoppers moved around him, stepping over his scattered groceries, shooting him curious glances that he didn't see. His hands were trembling, actually trembling, like he was coming down from some kind of high. She was alive. The thought kept circling his mind, refusing to settle into anything that made sense. For 7 years, he'd carried her death like a weight in his chest, had built his entire identity around being the man who'd lost everything. The tragic widower who'd been too young to handle such devastating loss. It was a story that earned him sympathy at dinner parties, understanding nods when he explained why he wasn't ready for commitment. But it had all been a lie. He drove home in a daze, muscle memory guiding him through traffic while his mind replayed every second of their encounter. The way she'd said their children's names, Lily, James, and Grace, like they were precious things he had no right to hear. The controlled fury in her voice when she'd called him out for abandoning them. The way she'd looked at him like he was a stranger. Which, he realized with a sick twist in his stomach, he was. His apartment felt different when he walked in. Too clean, too quiet, too carefully curated to look like success. The expensive furniture and abstract art that had once made him feel accomplished now felt like props in a play he'd been performing for an audience of one. He poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and sat on his leather couch, staring at the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows. His phone sat on the coffee table, silent and accusatory. How many times over the years had he picked it up, started to dial her number, then convinced himself it was better to let sleeping dogs lie? How many times had he told himself that reaching out would only cause more pain? The truth was uglier than that, and he knew it. He'd been a coward. Pure and simple. He'd run because staying would have required him to be stronger than he was, braver than he'd ever been. And he'd spent 7 years telling himself it was the noble thing to do. Meanwhile, across town, Isabella sat in her car in the dance studio parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd made it through the rest of her shopping, had even managed to smile and make small talk with the cashier, but now that she was alone, the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her emotions were starting to crack. She could see Grace through the studio windows, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face serious with concentration as she practiced her routine. 7 years old and already more disciplined than most adults, Isabella knew. All 3 of her children had that quality, a quiet strength that came from growing up in a house where resilience wasn't just encouraged, it was necessary for survival. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor. "Kids asking about dinner, should I start something?" Isabella stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain that she'd just seen their father? How could she tell them that the man she'd spent years helping them understand and forgive was alive and well and living 20 minutes away? She typed back, "On my way. Thank you." Simple. Clean. No hint of the chaos raging inside her chest. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. Every turn reminded her of the life she'd built from scratch. The pediatrician's office where she'd taken 3 sick babies alone, the park where she'd taught them to ride bikes, the library where they'd spent countless Saturday mornings reading stories about families that looked nothing like theirs. She'd worked so hard to create stability for them, to build a world where their father's absence was just a fact of life rather than a wound that wouldn't heal. She'd gone to therapy, had learned to separate her own pain from their need for understanding. She'd even practiced what she would say if he ever came back, had rehearsed forgiveness like lines in a play. But seeing him in person, older, successful, clearly thriving, had shattered all of that careful preparation. He'd looked shocked to see her alive, like her survival was somehow an inconvenience to whatever story he'd been telling himself about his own life. Grace burst through the front door like a small tornado, her dance bag flying behind her as she launched herself into Isabella's arms. "Mom! I nailed the triple turn. Miss Jennifer says I'm ready for the advanced class." Her face was flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with the kind of pure joy that only children could manage. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Isabella managed, holding her daughter close and breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "I'm so proud of you." James and Lily tumbled in behind their sister, full of stories about their day, their voices overlapping as they competed for their mother's attention. Isabella listened and nodded and made all the right responses, but part of her was still standing in that grocery store, watching David's face as he realized she wasn't the tragic memory he'd been carrying around. Later, after dinner and homework and bedtime stories, Isabella sat alone in her kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of her children sleeping, Grace's soft snoring, James talking in his sleep, Lily's restless turning as she fought with her blankets. This was her life. This was what she'd built from the ashes of his abandonment. And she'd be damned if she was going to let him waltz back in and disrupt the peace they'd all worked so hard to find. But even as she made that promise to herself, she couldn't shake the image of his face when he'd said her name. The way his voice had broken, like seeing her had broken something inside him too. How do you think Isabella should handle telling her children about seeing their father? Let me know what you think in the comments. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, jarring Isabella from the first peaceful sleep she'd managed since the grocery store encounter 3 days earlier. She fumbled for her phone, her heart immediately racing with the parents' instinctive fear that early morning calls brought bad news about her children. "Ms. Winters? This is Principal Hayes from Riverside Elementary. I'm calling about the incident this morning." Isabella sat up straighter, fully awake now. "What incident? Are my children okay?" "They're fine, physically. But there was an altercation in the parking lot during drop-off. James got into a fight with another student, and I'm afraid we need both sets of parents to come in for a conference before the children can return to class." Isabella's stomach dropped. James was her gentle soul, the peacemaker among the triplets. For him to get into a fight meant something was seriously wrong. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Actually, Ms. Winters, the other parent is already here. We're waiting for you in my office." The drive to school felt endless, Isabella's mind racing through possibilities. James had been quieter than usual the past few days, more withdrawn. She'd attributed it to her own distracted state after seeing David, but maybe there was more to it. Maybe her carefully constructed world was showing cracks that her children could sense. She hurried through the school's front entrance, her heels clicking against the polished floors as she made her way to the principal's office. Through the glass door, she could see Principal Hayes gesturing as she spoke to someone seated across from her desk, someone whose broad shoulders and dark hair made Isabella's steps falter. No, it couldn't be. But when she pushed open the door, David turned in his chair, and their eyes met for the second time in 3 days. His face went pale, his mouth opening slightly in shock that mirrored her own. "Ms. Winters," Principal Hayes said, standing. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I believe you know Mr. Thornton." The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Isabella's throat felt dry as sandpaper, but she managed a tight nod. "We've met." David stood as well, his movements careful and controlled. "Isabella, please both of you have a seat." Principal Hayes gestured to the chairs arranged in front of her desk. "We need to discuss what happened between James and Tyler this morning." Isabella sank into the chair beside David, hyper-aware of his presence, of the way he smelled like expensive cologne and coffee, of how his hands were clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. "Tyler is your son?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. "Yes." His voice was barely above a whisper. He's 7. The implication hit her like a physical blow. David had another child. A child the same age as their triplets. Which meant he'd moved on, had started a new family, while she was fighting for her life and raising his children alone. Principal Hayes cleared her throat. According to witnesses, the altercation started when Tyler made a comment about James not having a father. James responded by pushing Tyler down and saying his father was a coward who ran away. Tyler then said at least his father didn't abandon him, and that's when the physical fight began. Isabella felt sick. She'd worked so hard to help her children process their father's absence without bitterness, to help them understand that sometimes adults make mistakes that have nothing to do with their children's worth. But clearly, James was carrying more anger than she'd realized. "I'm so sorry," she said, looking at Principal Hayes. "James knows better than to use violence. This isn't like him." "Tyler shouldn't have said what he did either," David said quietly. "About James not having a father. That was cruel." Isabella turned to look at him then, really look at him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his usually perfect appearance seemed slightly disheveled. "How long has Tyler been at this school?" "We moved to the district last month." David's voice was careful, measured. "I didn't know. I had no idea your children attended here." The silence that followed was deafening. Principal Hayes looked between them, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "I think," the principal said slowly, "that perhaps you two need to have a conversation about how to help these boys move forward. They're in the same grade, and given the complexity of the situation, we need to ensure this doesn't happen again." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Isabella asked. "A mediated discussion between the children, with both parents present. Sometimes when children understand that the adults in their lives can communicate civilly, it helps them process their own emotions more effectively." Isabella's first instinct was to refuse, to grab James and transfer him to another school if necessary. But she looked at David's face and saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine remorse, and what looked like fear. Not fear of her, but fear of losing something he'd never really had. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. But I do need both boys to write apology letters to each other before they can return to class tomorrow. Perhaps you could coordinate that." The word coordinate felt impossible. How could she coordinate anything with a man who'd left her to die? But as she thought about James's angry words, calling his father a coward, she realized that her son was carrying wounds she couldn't heal alone. "Fine," she said. "We'll figure something out." As they left the principal's office, David caught up with her in the hallway. "Isabella, wait." She stopped but didn't turn around. "What, David? Can we talk? Really talk? Not here but somewhere private. About the kids, about what happened back then. About how to move forward." She turned slowly, studying his face. You have another child. Yes. He didn't try to deny it or explain it away. Her name is Rebecca. Tyler's mother. We were engaged. Were. David's jaw tightened. She ended it last week. Said I was emotionally unavailable, that I was carrying too much guilt about something I wouldn't talk about. He paused. She was right. Isabella stared at him for a long moment. One conversation. David. For the children. But don't mistake this for forgiveness. They met at a small coffee shop 15 minutes from the school, far enough away that they wouldn't run into other parents, but close enough that Isabella could leave quickly if she needed to. She arrived first, choosing a corner table where she could see the door, where she could control the space between them. David walked in 5 minutes later, looking around nervously before spotting her. He'd changed clothes since the school meeting, trading his business suit for jeans and a sweater that made him look younger, more like the man she'd once loved. Thank you, he said as he sat down across from her, for agreeing to this. Isabella wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, using the warmth to steady herself. This is about James and Tyler. Nothing else. I know. David ordered a black coffee from the waitress, his hands shaking slightly as he handed back the menu. Isabella, I need you to know that I never meant for things to happen the way they did. I never meant to hurt you or the children. But you did. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. You hurt us in ways I'm still trying to help them understand. David flinched but didn't look away. Tell me what happened. After I left. I need to know. Isabella studied his face, looking for signs that this was just curiosity, just guilt seeking absolution. But what she saw was something deeper, a man who'd been carrying a weight for 7 years and was finally ready to understand its true cost. The first month was the worst, she began, her voice steady despite the memories clawing at her chest. The chemo made me so sick I could barely stand, but the babies needed to eat every 2 hours. I'd set alarms, drag myself out of bed, and sometimes I'd fall asleep while feeding them. I was terrified I'd drop one of them. David's coffee sat untouched, growing cold as he listened. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, she started checking on us. Found me passed out on the kitchen floor one day with all 3 babies crying in their carriers. She called my sister in Portland, and Rachel drove down to help. Isabella's smile was bitter. Rachel, who'd never changed a diaper in her life, who was terrified of babies. But she stayed for 3 weeks, learned everything, because someone had to. I should have been there, David whispered. Yes, you should have. Isabella's voice didn't soften. You should have been there when James stopped breathing in his sleep and I had to do infant CPR while calling 911. You should have been there when the doctor told me the cancer had spread and I needed emergency surgery. You should have been there when I had to explain to a social worker why the father wasn't listed on any of the hospital forms. Each word hit David like a physical blow. He'd imagined her death as peaceful, quick. He'd never allowed himself to picture the reality of what his abandonment had meant. The social worker, Isabella continued. She was kind but thorough. Wanted to make sure I had support systems in place, that the children would be cared for if something happened to me. I had to provide a list of emergency contacts, backup caregivers. Your name wasn't on any of those lists, David. Because you'd made it clear that we were on our own. I was scared, David said, his voice breaking. I was 25 and I'd never even held a baby before, and suddenly there were 3 of them and you were dying and I didn't know how to. Stop. Isabella's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. Don't you dare make this about your fear. I was 23 and just as terrified, but I didn't have the luxury of running away. I had to figure it out because 3 tiny humans depended on me. The coffee shop buzzed with quiet conversation around them, the normal sounds of people living normal lives. Isabella envied them their ordinary problems, their simple Tuesday afternoon coffee dates. When did you find out? David asked quietly. That you were going to survive? There wasn't a moment, Isabella said. It was gradual. First, the surgery was successful. Then, the chemo started working. Then, 6 months became a year, became 2 years. But I couldn't think about survival in the beginning. I could only think about today. Getting through today. Making sure the babies were fed and safe and loved for one more day. She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The hardest part wasn't the cancer, David. It was explaining to 3 toddlers why other kids had daddies and they didn't. It was Lily asking if she'd done something wrong to make you leave. It was Grace drawing pictures of our family and always leaving a blank space where you should have been. David's face crumpled. God. Isabella. I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. Sorry doesn't give them back their father, Isabella said. Sorry doesn't erase the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering if I was enough for them. Sorry doesn't fix the fact that James thinks his father is a coward because that's the only way I could explain your absence without making them think it was their fault. Is that what you told them? That I'm a coward? Isabella met his eyes directly. I told them that sometimes people get scared and make bad choices. I told them that your leaving had nothing to do with them and everything to do with you not being strong enough to stay. I told them that real love means showing up even when things are hard. She paused. Was I wrong? David stared down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. No. You weren't wrong. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 7 years of unspoken truths. Finally, David looked up. I want to make this right, he said. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to be the father they deserve. If you'll let me. Isabella studied his face for a long moment. It's not about what I'll let you do, David. It's about what you're actually capable of doing. Because if you walk into their lives and then leave again, it will destroy them. And I won't let that happen. The apology letters were David's idea. Not the formal ones Principal Hayes had requested, but real letters, from father to children he'd never truly known. I don't know how to write to them, he admitted, his voice small across the coffee shop table. I don't know what they like, what makes them laugh, what scares them. I don't know anything about my own children. Isabella watched him struggle with the weight of that admission. For the first time since seeing him in the grocery store, she felt something other than anger, a flicker of the compassion that had once made her love him. James loves dinosaurs, she said quietly. Not the scary ones, the herbivores. He has this theory that they were misunderstood, that everyone focuses on the T-Rex but the real heroes were the ones who chose not to fight. She paused, the irony not lost on either of them. Lily is our little engineer. She builds these elaborate structures out of anything she can find. Blocks, books, couch cushions. And Grace. Grace feels everything deeply. She cries at commercials with sad dogs and gives her allowance to homeless people. David pulled out his phone and started typing notes, his fingers moving quickly as if he was afraid he'd forget these precious details. They all love pancakes on Sunday mornings, Isabella continued, surprised by how natural it felt to share these pieces of their children's lives. But they each want different shapes. James wants dinosaurs, Lily wants geometric patterns, and Grace wants hearts. It takes forever, but it's our tradition. What else? David asked, looking up from his phone. What else should I know? Isabella found herself talking for the next hour, painting pictures of their children with words. She told him about James's gentle nature, how he rescued injured birds and cried when they had to put down their elderly cat. She described Lily's methodical approach to everything, how she organized her crayons by color and always finished her homework before playing. She shared Grace's dramatic flair, her tendency to turn everyday moments into grand performances. They sound incredible, David said when she finally paused. They sound like you. They're their own people, Isabella corrected. But yes, they're incredible. David was quiet for a moment, staring at his phone full of notes. I met Rebecca when Tyler was 2, he said suddenly. His biological father left when she was pregnant. I thought I was being noble, stepping in to help raise another man's child. I told myself I was making up for my past mistakes. Isabella felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by shame. But you weren't really there for him either, were you? No. David's laugh was bitter. I was physically present, but emotionally, I was still running. Rebecca used to say I loved Tyler like he was a project, not a person. She was right. Is that why she left? David nodded. She said I was using their relationship to avoid dealing with my real family. She said until I faced what I'd done to you and the kids, I'd never be capable of truly loving anyone. He looked up at Isabella. She was right about that too. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his admission settling between them. Isabella found herself studying his face, looking for traces of the young man she'd once planned to marry. He was there, underneath the expensive clothes and careful composure, still vulnerable, still afraid, but maybe finally ready to stop running. The letters, she said finally. Write them honestly. Don't try to explain away what you did or make excuses. Just tell them who you are now and who you want to be for them. Will you help me? The question came out small, uncertain. Not write them for me, but make sure I don't say the wrong thing? Isabella's first instinct was to say no, to maintain the boundaries she'd worked so hard to build. But then she thought about James's angry words in the schoolyard, about the blank spaces in Grace's drawings, about Lily's careful questions about why some families looked different than others. Okay, she said. But we do this slowly. One step at a time. And if you hurt them again, David, if you make promises you can't keep, I will make sure you never get another chance. I understand. They moved to a quieter corner of the coffee shop, David pulling out a legal pad while Isabella watched him struggle with how to begin. His first attempt was too formal, like a business letter. His second was too casual, trying to be the fun dad he'd never been. It was his third try that made Isabella's breath catch. Dear James, Lily, and Grace, he read aloud. My name is David, and I'm your father. I know that might be confusing because fathers are supposed to be there from the beginning, and I wasn't. I made the biggest mistake of my life when I left you and your mom, and I've spent every day since then wishing I could take it back. He paused, looking at Isabella for approval. She nodded for him to continue. I can't change what I did, but I want you to know that leaving had nothing to do with you. You didn't do anything wrong. I was scared and young, and I made a terrible choice. Your mom is the strongest, bravest person I know, and she raised you to be amazing kids all by herself. Isabella felt tears prick at her eyes despite herself. I don't expect you to forgive me or even want to know me, David continued reading. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to be the father you deserve. I'd like to learn about dinosaurs and building things and whatever makes you happy. I'd like to be someone you can count on. He looked up at Isabella. Is that okay? For the first time in 7 years, Isabella smiled at him. Really smiled. It's a start. Do you think David deserves a second chance with his children? What would you do in Isabella's situation? Share your thoughts below. The meeting was supposed to be simple. David would give the letters to the children in Isabella's presence. They would have a brief, supervised conversation, and then he would leave. Baby steps. Isabella had insisted. No promises, no grand gestures, just a careful introduction to the idea that their father existed and wanted to know them. But nothing about David's return to their lives could ever be simple. Isabella had prepared the triplets as best she could, explaining that their father wanted to meet them, that he was sorry for being away, that they didn't have to do anything they weren't comfortable with. James had been skeptical, Lily curious, and Grace cautiously excited. They'd agreed to meet at the park near their house on Saturday afternoon, neutral territory where the children felt safe. David arrived early, pacing near the playground equipment like a caged animal. He'd changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on jeans and a simple blue shirt that Isabella had once said brought out his eyes. He clutched the 3 letters in his hand, the paper slightly damp from his nervous sweating. Isabella appeared first, walking across the grass with measured steps. Behind her, 3 small figures hung back, clearly uncertain. David's breath caught in his throat as he saw them properly for the first time. Not glimpses in a grocery store or school hallway, but his children, walking toward him with Isabella's eyes and his own stubborn chin. "Kids," Isabella said gently when they reached the picnic table where David waited. "This is David. Your father." The silence that followed was deafening. James stood slightly in front of his sisters, protective even at 7 years old. Lily studied David with the same analytical gaze she used for her building projects. Grace hid partially behind Isabella's leg, peeking out with curious eyes. "Hi," David said, his voice cracking slightly. I brought you something." He held out the letters with shaking hands. James stepped forward first, taking his letter with a careful politeness Isabella had taught them. Lily and Grace followed suit, their small fingers brushing against David's as they accepted their envelopes. "Can we read them now?" Grace asked, looking up at Isabella. "If you want to, sweetheart." David watched, his heart hammering against his ribs, as his children opened his letters. He saw James's eyebrows furrow in concentration, Lily's lips moving silently as she read, Grace's face lighting up with understanding. "You're really our dad?" Grace asked, looking up from her letter. "Yes," David managed. "I really am. Why did you leave?" James's question was direct, challenging. "Mom said you got scared, but grown-ups aren't supposed to get scared." David knelt down to James's eye level, trying to find words that would make sense to a 7-year-old. "Grown-ups get scared too, buddy. And sometimes we make really bad choices when we're scared. I made the worst choice possible when I left you and your mom. Were you scared of us?" Lily asked, her engineer's mind seeking logical explanations. "No, sweetheart. I was scared of not being good enough for you. But that was my problem, not yours." They talked for 20 minutes, the children's questions gradually becoming less guarded, more curious. David told them about his work, about Tyler, about how he'd thought about them every day. Isabella watched from a few feet away, her heart cautiously hopeful as she saw her children begin to relax around the stranger who was their father. That's when Rebecca arrived. Isabella saw her first, a tall, elegant woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes, walking across the park with determined strides. Behind her, a boy who looked exactly like David at that age trailed reluctantly. "David!" Rebecca's voice carried across the playground, sharp with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" David's face went white as he stood up, instinctively moving between Rebecca and the children. "Rebecca, what are you doing here? Tyler told me you were meeting your other family today." She spat the words like they tasted bitter. "I came to see for myself what was more important than the family you actually had." Isabella stepped forward, her protective instincts flaring. "I think you should leave." Rebecca's laugh was cold, calculating. "Oh, you must be the cancer patient. The one he's been carrying around like some tragic love story for 7 years. Her eyes swept over Isabella dismissively. "You know he only came back because I left him, right? This isn't about wanting to be a father. This is about his guilt." "Rebecca, stop." David's voice was low, dangerous. "Don't do this here. Not in front of the kids." "Why not? They should know the truth." Rebecca's voice rose, drawing stares from other families at the park. They should know that their father spent 7 years playing house with another woman's child while pretending they didn't exist. They should know that he only remembered they were alive when his backup plan fell through. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. Around her, she could sense her children's confusion and growing distress. Grace had started to cry, and James was backing away from David like he'd been burned. "Is that true?" James asked, his voice small and hurt. Did you only come back because she left you? David opened his mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Because there was truth in Rebecca's accusation, wasn't there? He had been content to let sleeping dogs lie until his comfortable life had fallen apart. He had only found the courage to face his past when his present became unbearable. James, You're just like she said, James interrupted, his voice growing stronger with anger. You're a coward. You only came back because you had nowhere else to go. That's not, David started, but Lily cut him off. You have another family, she said, her analytical mind putting the pieces together. You chose them instead of us. No, that's not how it happened. Yes, it is. Grace's voice was thick with tears. You left us and got a new family and only came back when they didn't want you either. Isabella watched her children's faces crumble, watched 7 years of careful healing shatter in the space of 5 minutes. The rage that filled her chest was unlike anything she'd ever felt, not the cold anger of abandonment, but the fierce, protective fury of a mother watching her children's hearts break. Get away from them, she said, her voice deadly quiet. Get away from my children right now. Isabella, please. Now! The word exploded from her chest, causing other parkgoers to turn and stare. You've done enough damage for one lifetime. David looked at his children, at James's angry tears, at Lily's closed-off expression, at Grace sobbing into Isabella's leg, and knew that he'd lost them again. This time, maybe forever. David sat in his car outside the park for 2 hours after Isabella had taken the children home, watching families come and go, watching other fathers push their kids on swings and catch them at the bottom of slides. His phone had 17 missed calls from Rebecca and a text that simply read, "Now you know how it feels." But he didn't care about Rebecca anymore. He didn't care about his bruised ego or his comfortable life or any of the excuses he'd been making for 7 years. All he could see were his children's faces, the way James had looked at him like he was poison, the way Lily had shut down completely, the way Grace had sobbed into Isabella's leg like her heart was breaking. He'd done that. Again. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and turn signals, his mind replaying every moment of the disaster at the park. Rebecca's words echoed in his head. He only came back because I left him. The worst part was that she wasn't entirely wrong. If his life with her and Tyler had been perfect, would he have ever found the courage to face what he'd done to Isabella and the triplets? His apartment felt like a mausoleum when he walked in, all expensive furniture and empty spaces, a monument to a life built on avoidance. He poured himself a drink, then poured it down the sink. He needed to think clearly, needed to figure out how to fix this mess he'd created. His laptop sat on the kitchen counter, and almost without thinking, he opened it and began to type. My name is David Thornton, and 7 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. The words flowed out of him like water from a broken dam, the whole story, unvarnished and raw. He wrote about being 25 and terrified, about running from the hospital when Isabella needed him most. He wrote about the years of telling himself she was dead, about building a life on the foundation of that lie. He wrote about meeting Rebecca and Tyler, about trying to be a father to another man's child while his own children grew up without him. He wrote about seeing Isabella in the grocery store, alive and strong and beautiful. He wrote about learning that his children existed, that they had names and personalities and dreams he knew nothing about. He wrote about the letters, about the brief moment when he thought he might have a chance to make things right. And he wrote about today, about Rebecca's cruel words, about watching his children's trust shatter, about realizing that he'd hurt them again just by existing in their space. When he finished, it was 3 a.m, and he had 12 pages of the most honest writing he'd ever done. He read it through once, then again, then saved it and closed the laptop. He knew what he had to do. Meanwhile, across town, Isabella sat in her darkened living room, listening to the sounds of her children finally sleeping. It had taken hours to calm them down, to answer their questions, to reassure them that they were safe and loved and that none of this was their fault. James had been angry, ranting about fathers who made promises they couldn't keep. Lily had been analytical, trying to understand the logic of adult behavior that made no sense. Grace had been heartbroken, asking over and over why their daddy didn't want them. Isabella had answered as best she could, but inside, she was furious. Furious at David for giving them hope and then snatching it away. Furious at Rebecca for using children as weapons in her adult drama. Furious at herself for believing, even for a moment, that David might have actually changed. Her phone buzzed with a text message. David's name appeared on the screen, and her first instinct was to delete it without reading. But something made her open it. "I know you never want to see me again, and I understand why. But please read what I'm about to send you. Not for me, but for them. They deserve to know the whole truth, even if it doesn't change anything." A minute later, her email chimed with a message from David containing a document attachment. Isabella stared at it for a long moment, her finger hovering over the delete button. Then, against her better judgment, she opened it. She read the entire thing without stopping, her emotions cycling through anger, sadness, and something that might have been understanding. It was raw and honest in a way that David had never been before, not just admitting his mistakes, but truly understanding their cost. The last paragraph made her breath catch. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I know I've lost the right to be their father, and I accept that. But I want them to know that leaving them was the worst thing I've ever done, and that every day since has been a punishment I deserved. I want them to know that they are perfect and wonderful and that my inability to love them properly was never about them. It was about me being broken in ways I didn't even understand. I want them to know that their mother is a hero, and that they should be proud to be her children. And I want them to know that even though I failed them, they will always be loved. By her, by the family she's built around them, and yes, by me, even if I never get to show them that love again." Isabella closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but of something more complicated. Grief for the family they might have been, anger at the years they'd lost, and underneath it all, a tiny seed of something that might have been hope. Her phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. She stared at it for 3 rings, 4, 5. Then, just before it went to voicemail, she answered. "What do you want, David?" "I want to do something for them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something that doesn't require them to see me or forgive me or give me anything in return. I want to set up college funds for all 3 of them. I want to make sure they never have to worry about money for school or anything else they need." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "That's not going to fix what happened today." "I know. But it's something I can do that's actually about them, not about me. No strings attached, no conditions. Just, let me do this one thing right." Isabella closed her eyes, thinking about her children's faces, about their dreams and futures. "Okay," she said finally. "But David." "Yeah. After this, you stay away. You don't contact them, you don't show up at their school, you don't try to insert yourself into their lives. You do this one good thing, and then you let them heal." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Isabella thought he might have hung up. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll stay away." 3 months later, Isabella stood in the kitchen making Sunday morning pancakes. Dinosaurs for James, geometric patterns for Lily, hearts for Grace. It had become their ritual of healing, this deliberate return to normalcy, this insistence that their world was still whole and safe despite the earthquake that had shaken it. The college fund paperwork had arrived 6 weeks ago, along with a letter from David's lawyer explaining that substantial accounts had been established for each child, with Isabella as the sole trustee. No strings attached, no conditions, just as he'd promised. She'd put the papers in her safe and told the children that someone who cared about their future had made sure they could go to any college they wanted. She hadn't heard from David since that night phone call, and she'd begun to believe that maybe, finally, he would keep his word about staying away. That's when the doorbell rang. Isabella's heart jumped into her throat, her first thought being that David had broken his promise. But when she opened the door, she found a young boy standing on her porch. Tyler, David's stepson, holding a carefully wrapped package and looking nervous. "Hi," he said quietly. "Are you Isabella? James and Lily and Grace's mom?" "Yes, sweetheart. What are you doing here? Where's your mom?" "She's in the car." Tyler pointed to a sedan parked at the curb where Rebecca sat behind the wheel, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I asked her to bring me. I wanted to give this to James." Isabella looked down at the package in Tyler's hands, confusion and wariness warring in her chest. "What is it?" "It's my dinosaur book collection. My stepdad. He told me that James likes dinosaurs too, especially the nice ones. I thought maybe James would like to have them." The simple generosity of the gesture, coming from a child who had every reason to resent James and his siblings, made Isabella's throat tight with emotion. "That's very kind of you, Tyler. Would you like to come in and give them to him yourself?" Tyler nodded eagerly, and Isabella called over her shoulder. "Kids, we have a visitor." The triplets appeared in the hallway, still in their pajamas, their faces curious and slightly wary when they saw Tyler. James hung back, remembering the fight at school, but Lily and Grace stepped forward with the natural friendliness of children. "Hi," Grace said. "I'm Grace. Are you Tyler?" "Yeah." Tyler shifted the package in his arms. "I brought something for James. If he wants it." James approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the wrapped bundle. "What is it?" "Books about dinosaurs. The good kind, not the scary ones. David said you like those." At the mention of David's name, the atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. But Tyler continued, his 7-year-old honesty cutting through the adult complications. "He talks about you guys a lot," Tyler said. "About how smart you are and how much he wishes he could know you better. He's really sad that he messed up so bad." Isabella felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "Tyler. I know he's not perfect," Tyler continued, looking directly at James. "He wasn't always the best stepdad either. But he's trying to be better now. He goes to therapy and everything. And he really, really loves you guys, even if he can't show you." James took the package with careful hands, unwrapping it to reveal a collection of beautifully illustrated books about herbivorous dinosaurs. His eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. "These are really good books," he said quietly. "I know. I love them, but I'm getting too old for them now. And David said you'd take good care of them." "I will," James promised solemnly. Tyler smiled, then looked at Isabella. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think maybe someday James and Lily and Grace could come to my birthday party? It's next month, and I don't have very many friends, and David said they're really cool kids." Isabella's heart clenched. This child, caught in the middle of adult mistakes and complicated emotions, just wanted friends. Just wanted to connect with the siblings he'd never been allowed to know. "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea," she said softly. "If it's okay with your mom." "She said yes already. She said it's time we all stopped being mad about things we can't change." Later, after Tyler had left and the children were playing quietly with the dinosaur books, Isabella found herself staring out the kitchen window, thinking about forgiveness and second chances and the complicated mathematics of love. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Tyler told me what he did. I didn't ask him to, but I'm grateful he did. Thank you for being kind to him. He needs friends, and your kids are lucky to have you as their mom. I hope someday they can forgive me, but I understand if they can't. David." Isabella stared at the message for a long time, then typed back, "The kids would like to come to Tyler's party. We'll be there." The response came quickly. "I'll make sure I'm not there. I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable." Isabella's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She thought about her children's faces as they'd looked through Tyler's books, about the careful way James had thanked his half-brother, about Grace asking if Tyler could come play again soon. "Actually," she typed, "maybe it's time we all learned how to be in the same room without the world ending." But David, if you're going to be part of their lives, even peripherally, you need to understand that this isn't about you getting what you want. This is about what's best for them. Always. I understand. And Isabella, thank you for everything. Isabella set down her phone and walked back to the living room, where her 3 children were sprawled on the floor, reading about gentle giants who chose cooperation over conflict. James looked up at her with David's eyes and her own stubborn chin. Mom, do you think people can really change? Isabella sat down beside him, pulling Grace into her lap while Lily leaned against her shoulder. I think people can choose to do better, she said carefully. But change has to be proven over time, not just promised with words. Tyler seems nice, Grace said. And he said David is trying to be better. What do you think? Isabella asked. Do you want to give him another chance? The 3 children looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that twins and triplets were famous for. Finally, James spoke for all of them. Maybe. But just a little chance. And if he messes up again, we're done forever. Isabella smiled, pulling all 3 of her children closer. That sounds like a very wise plan. Outside, the sun was shining, and for the first time in 7 years, Isabella allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their story might have a different ending than she'd imagined. Not the fairy tale she'd once dreamed of, but something real and complicated and ultimately more beautiful. A family rebuilt on truth instead of fantasy, on choice instead of obligation, on love that had been tested and proven strong enough to survive even the deepest betrayals. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and difficult conversations and moments when the old wounds would ache. But as she watched her children plan Tyler's birthday party with the same enthusiasm they brought to everything else, Isabella knew they would be okay. They were survivors, all of them. And sometimes that was enough. What do you think about second chances and forgiveness? Have you ever had to rebuild trust after a major betrayal? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might help someone else who's facing a similar situation.